Hey everybody, happy Monday. Hope you're all doing well. I like this little ritual that we've started, starting off our week right, um, with the opportunity to ask some Q&A questions and hear from you and what's important to you. So I've really been enjoying this. Hopefully you had a chance to tune in to watch my virtual town hall that I did with Medina last night. If not, I think it's probably still on my story if you want to go watch that. That was a great conversation that her and I had. So thanks for joining today and thanks for submitting some questions. I hope everybody is still able to stay healthy. If you're able to stay home, you are. If you are working, I hope that you are given safe working conditions by your employer, which is actually a great place to start because last week I started by talking about people that we'd heard from who work in the IT department at Bay Health. And they reported that they weren't being allowed to work remotely. And we did get an update on that. The Dover Post last week did a story about it and covered the fact that these IT employees felt unsafe and felt like they were potentially going to jeopardize the stability of the Bay Health system if they were to get sick, that all of the IT infrastructure would not be able to be supported. There was another story where management responded and they basically said they weren't going to be making any changes. It sounds like that wasn't even communicated directly to employees as a response to their concerns. It was only sent to the Dover Post in response. So they're still not allowed to work remotely. We'll post that story again just to share so you can share it and spread the word. You know, these workers are really just asking for their health to be protected and the health of the patients and the health of, frankly, the healthcare system. And we should really be listening to them. Every single worker deserves to have safe working conditions. And just because these workers are not within the actual medical unit, not on the floor where, medical professionals are treating COVID-19, doesn't mean that they aren't still susceptible to infection, which would jeopardize the strength of the health system. So we'll share that again, and please continue to share it and support them and ask for them to be able to work from home so that they can stay as safe as possible. All right, so some questions I got ahead of time were about there being another police shooting this week, and what should we be doing to end police brutality. So there have been, if I'm counting, there's been 3 this year, police shootings in Delaware, and there were at least 2 that I know of last year. So within only about 12 months, 13 months time, there have been 5 police shootings in our state. I think that's something that we should absolutely be concerned about. The ways that I think we combat this is, first and foremost, when these things happen, there need to be independent investigations, and that those results and the results of that investigation absolutely need to be reported out. It can't just be that these things go dark and they're handled internally. One of the officers who shot someone last year had already shot someone in years prior. I think that is an indication that that person should no longer be on the police force, and these are the types of things that need to be shared publicly. I think another thing is that we absolutely need to invest in body cameras and ensure that they are always running and that footage is made available to those independent investigations. But those are really things that come into play after the fact, and they help the public and investigators know what happened, but they don't necessarily put an end to things. So I think one of the first ways that you can start to end police brutality is to pull back on the amount of things that are criminalized. When you criminalize things that otherwise seem innocuous, like sleeping on a park bench or being in a park after dark, or things like drinking in public, you're creating more places where police need to actually interact with people, and unnecessarily. these things should not be things that we are actively policing. We also need to, frankly, decriminalize poverty. A lot of times, the neighborhoods that are the poorest are the ones that are being policed the most. And it leads to people feeling constantly surveilled. I mean, this is something that when we were out canvassing, we heard frequently from people, was that they felt like the cops basically just posted up on the corner in their neighborhood and watched them. And it incited a kind of anger and a fear in people and made them uncomfortable with the police force. I think this also extends to actually getting help for people who are addicted or mentally ill and not treating those things like crimes. Those are people who need help, not to be put in jail. A lot of times I've seen this firsthand myself in the city of Wilmington. Like if someone is acting erratically, it might be because of addiction or some sort of mental illness. And when that gets met with an escalating police force, it escalates even further and it can turn into brutality, and not just shootings, but also just like aggressive handling of people. We saw this I think it was last week. Police were aggressively handling young men in, I believe, Southbridge, where, again, it just escalated because they were upset that these teens kind of walked away from the police. And it was actually unclear about why the police were trying to stop them in the first place, which goes into, frankly, like actually adhering to the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure. Like a lot of the times that people are having altercations that escalate, they are coming from unnecessary stops, and stops that are driven by this idea of suspicion. I saw it reported on the man who was shot in his car this weekend. It was reported out as he was in a suspicious vehicle. It's unclear about what a suspicious vehicle is. And that's the type of thing that, again, escalates the situation, makes the person who's being accosted by the police feel unsafe as well, and just creates this increased aggression and escalation that can often lead to brutality or shootings or people getting hurt in those altercations. So jumping back to questions here. Okay, so Joanne has a question about climate change. It says, reducing climate change policy, want to reduce CO2 emissions from transportation. How do you intend to do so? Does this mean ramping up public transportation efforts? Are transportation emissions the only ones you're concerned about? Just curious about specifics. And sounds like Joanne's a climate scientist, and I would love to chat separately. That's awesome. I maybe would love to talk to you on one of these videos if you're up for it. So transportation emissions are not the only emissions that I care about. They are a huge part, and I think if we can invest in infrastructure that builds out public transportation, then we can get more cars off the road and cut down those emissions. They are absolutely a contributing factor, but they're not the only thing. But I do think that one of the ways that we invest in the reasons that you invest in a Green New Deal are because you would take on those infrastructure projects that not only decrease emissions, but also create really good paying jobs for people to help build out that infrastructure. I think the other emissions and the other factors that I think about at climate change is actually ending all drilling for fossil fuels and completely ending our dependence on fossil fuels and the extraction of fossil fuels. I believe that we should be completely moving away from them and getting to zero emissions. The other factors are the fact that, right now we have banks, the biggest banks in our country invest in those fossil fuel projects. That absolutely has to stop. That's like part of slowing all of this down and recognizing that we cannot rely on fossil fuels going forward. There's also factors around buildings in general being not only more efficient, but also being efficient, and then also creating buildings that have net zero carbon emissions, and buildings that are retrofitted in a way that they're protected against climate change. So when we talk about stronger storms, or we talk about storm surges or flooding, how do we make sure that our infrastructure is actually resilient against that? And I think it's not just about emissions that come from individuals. I think a lot of what we've been told is like, a lot of the change that we've been asked to make has been on the individual level, and that's not where we're going to get the biggest impact. I do think because the transportation system is so far reaching, you do get a large impact there, but we have to recognize that the majority of the carbon emissions that have been put into the atmosphere are from industry and from corporations, not from individual behavior. And that's really where we're going to get the biggest change as well. All right. So Kevin has a question about marijuana. Would you be willing to force a bill that would take marijuana off the Schedule 1 narcotic list? Yeah, I absolutely think that marijuana needs to be legalized. It should not be a Schedule 1 drug. Like, it has been legalized in other states without adverse effects. We have gotten medical here in Delaware, but have not been able, and we have decriminalized possession, small amount possession, and we haven't seen negative effects. So I absolutely think that marijuana should be legalized and would support that. Will says hey. Hey, Will. Jen says hey. Hey, Jen. All right. Yeah, so LeVar asked a great question about people who can't make bail, who are much more likely to take a plea. I believe that we should be ending cash bail. Cash bail keeps people in jail who can't afford to post that bail. And it means that they sit in detention longer while they're waiting for trial. And it also means that, to LeVar's point, that they're more likely to take a plea just to get home. So cash bail is not something I support, and I think we should be working to end it. In places where it has been ended, again, we have not seen it lead to an influx of crime or an influx of people skipping town. When you get rid of cash bail, particularly for low-level offenses, it makes it so that you're not criminalizing poverty, which is essentially what cash bail does for a lot of people. Any other questions? Let me see. That really segues, I think, into a related question. I think we've talked about this a couple times in the past few weeks, but there are people in our prisons right now who are sitting there in what's called pre-trial detention, unable to get out because they can't post bail. And us as a campaign, me individually, have been really concerned about the health of those people, particularly during this pandemic. We've seen in other states and other places how prisons have become breakout centers of COVID-19 because people are kept in close proximity of one another. They don't have the ability to self-isolate most of the time. So particularly for people that are in jail because they haven't been able to post bail on those low-level offenses, we've been pushing, as well as the ACLU of Delaware has been pushing, to release people who match that description, so that we have a smaller population in our prisons, and that we can ensure that people are not coming into contact with each other if they don't have to, so that we limit the spread of COVID-19. We haven't gotten that so far. ACLU is still pushing for it. We're still communicating it. I think it's a great opportunity to reach out to both the governor and the secretary of the DOJ, because I think that we should be recognizing that people who are in jail should not be subjected to potentially death because of this pandemic. Especially when we are talking about lower level offenses or people who haven't even been convicted of a crime. I know that at Vaughan in particular, they have tried to limit the interactions between inmates, but they've also had, I believe, at least 12 cases there between people who worked there and inmates. So that can spiral out of control really quickly. And we're definitely concerned about incarcerated people getting sick and dying because they were unable to get out of prison and avoid this pandemic. Kevin wants to talk maybe one-on-one or in chat to talk about vets and the issues we have. I definitely would love to do that, so we can set that up separately. Not seeing any other questions right now. One thing we could talk about is that, again, in the light of there being this pandemic, we've been phone banking quite a bit. We've been checking in on people, seeing how they're doing. And as long as people are doing okay, we reach out and then we say, well, I'm Jess and I'm running for Senate and here's what I'm running on. And we've been talking to a lot of people about the platform and the campaign. And I will say the response that I've been hearing, particularly around Medicare for All, has been really positive. And I think people who even expressed hesitance about it previously are much more interested in hearing about it. And I think that is incredibly important, and that we have to recognize that this is an opportunity to push for the change that we know we need. We know that if we had Medicare for All in place, and if we had the investments in the hospital infrastructure and the medical infrastructure that we needed and need in this country, that we would probably be in a better place with this crisis right now. Because of our drive to make profits off of our healthcare system, we have harmed our healthcare system. There have been hundreds of hospitals, if not thousands, closed in our country in recent years because they weren't profitable. And that disproportionately affects people of color, neighborhoods that are poorer, and more rural neighborhoods where people are miles and miles from a hospital now and don't have the concept of a doctor, their family doctor anymore. I think something like Medicare for All absolutely has to come with an investment in medical infrastructure for that reason. And I think that we should be talking about it more, and we shouldn't be hesitant about having this conversation in the midst of the pandemic, because this is the time when it matters most to people. This is the time when people who didn't see how it was broken before are seeing how it's broken now. And it would be a real disservice to not offer them a solution that can help us be stronger against this the next time it happens. So that's what we're continuing to do with our campaign, and continuing to have that conversation. I hope that you do that with your friends and family as well, because it can't just come from the campaign, and it can't just come from national media or local media even. It really is, these are the conversations that when you have them one-on-one and you explain to your friends and family like why you believe this is important, that's really the stuff that changes minds. Like, yes, our phone banking is very important, and it does make people aware of our campaign and the platform. And when people have questions, we answer them. And our volunteers are incredible at connecting with people and making them recognize that understand the reasons why they're volunteering for the campaign and see the passion that they have for it. But that can extend to the conversations that you have with people in your family too. So if that is something you care about, now is like absolutely a great time to be having those conversations about why Medicare for All is the right choice for our country, because relying on a for-profit system is, as we know from studies, it means almost 70,000 people die a year just because they don't have the ability to go to the doctor. It means 500,000 people end up going into bankruptcy because of medical debt every single year. And it means we spend an extra $450 billion every single year on this system. Now is the time to absolutely be having that conversation. So please do. All right, so a question that someone sent through messages. How do you vote in the presidential primary and with social distancing? Great question. Our presidential primary, just to be clear with everyone, still is on. It was scheduled for April 28th. It is now moved to June 2nd. And because of COVID-19, you are allowed to vote absentee just because you don't want to go to the polls in person. So what you can do is go to ivote.de.gov and you can request your absentee ballot there. They will mail you the ballot. You fill it out. Comes with instructions, comes with an envelope to send it back. You fill out the ballot, you stick it back in the envelope, sign the envelope, and then you put it in the mail back to, I think it's done by county, and it goes back to your county board of elections. So that's how you social distance and vote in our presidential primary. But we don't really have an answer just yet for the fall elections. So our election is on September 15th, and then the general election is on November 3rd. We don't exactly know where we're going to be with coronavirus and this pandemic. So what you can do right now is that there's a really good bill in the General Assembly to get vote by mail in our state. It would go into effect for this fall if we can pass it when the General Assembly comes back into session. So what I would recommend is contact your state rep and your state senator and ask them to sponsor the vote by mail bill. It's HB 175. And that would get us vote by mail for the fall. So what would happen there? Same thing. You request your ballot. It gets mailed to you. You're able to mail that in. You don't have to worry about actually getting to the polling place on election day. You can mail it. I believe that it would also allow for drop-off locations if you wanted to drop it off. So we have good options in our state on the table. If we can get that passed, particularly for the fall, that would be awesome. You are able to vote absentee right now, though, for the presidential primary, as long as you just go to ivote.de.gov and ask for your absentee ballot. So LeVar asked a question about reaching out to high school seniors and answered in the chat here a bit, but just to talk to that too. Yeah, so we are calling and texting voters pretty much every day now because we can't go out and canvass and knock on doors. We've moved to the phones, we've moved to texting. And with that effort, it is about like engaging younger voters. I think what we believe is that if we can engage those younger voters, if we can get them registered if they're not already, that's really how we win. We see what the younger generation is asking for. And what they are getting in response is people telling them that their ideas are wild-eyed and they're not possible. And I think when we tell the younger generation that I hear that you are asking for a future. You are saying you are scared of what the planet will look like in 10 to 15 years. And the response you should not be given is a pat on the head and told that adults will handle it. The response you should be getting when you are asking for the people in power to ensure you have a future is, yes, absolutely, get involved with this fight. And that's what we are trying to do with younger people in particular, is saying, you know, like, this isn't just about putting me in place and me going away and going to Washington and just ignoring you for 6 years. It's really about how do we do this together? And I think that is the way that younger people want to be engaged in politics. A lot of people are disconnected from politics or government in general because they don't feel like there's a way to break in, because there isn't, because they've been told this entire time that it's for other people to handle. And frankly, I have felt that way. And that is partially why I'm running for office. And I think while I am not young maybe anymore, I'm still closer to understanding what someone who is, 18 or 20 is feeling. I feel very similar about fears of what the planet will look like and what storms will be like and what pandemics will be like and what will happen when the land that people live on becomes uninhabitable. And the last thing I want to hear from my leaders is that those are not real concerns, because they absolutely are. And I think that's the way that you actually engage younger people, saying like, what are you concerned about? And help me shape the policy that will help you. There's a lot of sources of questions. Okay, so there's a question about views on foreign powers intervening in our democracy and what measures you support to combat it. I think first and foremost, I think when people hear that question, a lot of people start thinking about like election security, which I think is important. But I also think we have to think about the role that like capital and big money plays in our government and the influence that it has and how that allows foreign influence in. That is a major problem. When you look at the dollars that drive the decisions that are made by our government and the people who get helped in a crisis like we're having right now, you see those effects. And I think that what flows from that is that there are people who domestically benefit from those connections, who have money that flows to them from international people, in both, business and in government. And what happens is that doesn't get punished either. We were talking about things that are criminalized earlier. We do I don't want to say a better job, but we do a lot more work around criminalizing the poor and people who are in poverty than we do about actually tracking down people who are doing white collar crime or crime that is done by the people in power. I think that the other factor is that we have an incredibly imperialistic foreign policy that escalates issues rather than de-escalates. And we seem to approach every problem with the same sort of bullying behavior. And I think that actually causes the interference that we see, rather than being able to take a diplomatic approach or not intervening ourselves in other people's elections or in other people's governments. If we take those actions, they'll be less likely to have intervention that comes back on us. And I think we can't be. I think that ties into the same thing. It can't be an effort of America to try to intervene in not only elections but also in the governing of foreign countries. I think we really have to make sure that we are not being foreign interferers if we don't want it happening to us as well. There's a question of what are my views on Antifa, and I think that we should absolutely be anti-fascist. Doesn't seem hard. Should we have a state website dedicated to positive COVID-19 cases identified by business location so consumers can make informed shipping decisions? Interesting. I haven't thought about that. I think that one thing we are maybe not doing as well is communicating out where there have been cases. It does feel like that's kind of intermittent, and we hear it if it comes from, say, the state prisons or state offices, but we're not necessarily hearing it when it comes from private businesses. So as an example, I haven't heard any reporting of anything in grocery stores, but I have heard it in other states. So I don't know if that's because it hasn't happened, which is what I hope is the case, or if it's because it's not being reported because it's not being cataloged and tracked that way. I do think that it's important that if there are cases, that people who may have been exposed are able to be informed about that, because that's how we stop this, right? If I've been exposed, the best thing for me to know is that I've been exposed so that I stay home as much as possible. I'm already staying home as much as possible, but if the grocery store I go to had cases and it was around the day that I was there, I think it's important that that information does get disseminated out, and it's not really happening right now as far as I can tell. I think the way that I've been trying to operate is that if I go out, I act like I am a carrier and I act like I've been exposed when I come home. And I think that's probably the safest approach for everyone right now, with the limited testing that we're seeing and with the lack of communication that we really have about exactly where cases are. And the best bet would be that we were actually able to test everyone and figure out who's positive and who's carrying and who's asymptomatic, and actually use that information to keep people safe. But with the lack of testing that we have available, not only in the state, but in the country, that is not feasible. So I think our best bet is to act as if you're a carrier and act as if you have contracted it at all times. All right. Okay, how do you overcome a large Delaware-specific obstacle to electing an anti-establishment candidate, aka the Delaware Way, which is stopping moderates and centrists from progressives? Um, hmm. So, in case there is anyone who's not aware of this phrase, the Delaware Way, um, I think when people characterize the Delaware Way as a positive, they see it as we're small, we know who's in power, we can just get in the room and we can hash this out. But the people who see that the negative side of that recognize that who's often in that room are not the people who the decisions being made actually affect. It's often has been historically the leaders in the state, corporate leaders, elected leaders, not the regular people whose those decisions have to live with. I think that in Delaware, this idea of like progressive primary is still kind of new. Um, you know, it's only happened a few times in the last few years. And previously, there were very few primaries at all. There was a lot of someone ran for a seat and they got the seat and they kind of just stayed there until they decided they wanted to try for a different seat or they wanted to retire. So I think that's where a little bit of the hesitance that I have encountered comes from is like this still seems a little new and foreign. Um, However, there's definitely a lot of people who are open to it, and I think recognize that like being elected doesn't guarantee you that seat for life. And in a per, at least statewide and in a statewide race where our state is predominantly Democratic and tends to vote Democratic, if you don't challenge in the primary, there's really no challenge to that person. And I think um, as national conversations have started to change, people are becoming much more open to not only the idea of the primary, but also to more progressive policy ideas. And I think we are benefiting from that. Take Medicare for All, a Green New Deal, free tuition free college. Like these are all things that I don't think seem shocking to people anymore. That might have 2 to 4 years ago. Like I think even 2 years ago, Medicare for All people were like still very afraid of. Now that conversation is a lot easier. And I think it's just going to continue to go that way. I think what's really important here is kind of what I was talking about before, where like talk to your people because that's where change actually comes from. Like if you, I said this to my neighbor who told me he was going to support us and vote for me. And I said, can you please talk to your friends and family? Because when they hear it from you, someone they trust, someone who is of a similar background or lives a similar life, it means a lot more because there's a lot of people who I think consider a progressive or a challenger candidate, but there's this either fear or hesitance to try something new. And when you hear from people in your life that no, I'm voting for this person and this is why, that's really what makes a difference for a lot of people. It's yes, it's like I said, it's important for us to contact them, introduce ourselves, share the platform, but a lot of the mind changing happens on a one-on-one level. And that's what we try to do with canvassing and phone banking, but like that gets reinforced when they hear it directly from you. And so if you are a supporter of this campaign, number one thing, please become a volunteer in phone bank. Number two thing, talk to the people in your life about it because it does make people feel more comfortable when they know that they're not alone in wanting to support these policies. Okay. Um, Someone asked if I would send Paul Manafort to The Hague. I think this ties in a little bit to what I was talking about before, where the things that we punish and criminalize are disproportionately, we see punishment of poor people. And then you see people like Paul Manafort getting essentially a slap on the wrist. And that is absolutely something that needs to change. We can no longer have this multi-tiered justice system that criminalizes poverty and puts away people for unbelievably long sentences when really that person needed help or needed a leg up, and then treats people like Paul Manafort as if, it's an excusable offense. Billy asked a question about self-employed people not receiving unemployment. Yeah, so this is an issue that I've heard both in Delaware and then in other states right now. You should be able to, if you were self-employed, you should be able, or gig worker, part-time worker, contract worker, all those different classifications that don't typically qualify for unemployment insurance, you should at the very least be able to qualify for the extra $600 that was fought for in the CARES Act that was passed last month. I think the issue that most people are running into right now is that the state level systems are not set up to handle that yet. I think Delaware is getting closer. I know they are capturing that information about people. So when you apply, I believe they're asking those questions so that they can get that money out to people. But I think what is happening is that there are not the structures in place to actually fulfill that law right now, which unfortunately is not a great answer because people need money. Same thing goes for that $1,200 check that some people are going to get. No one's gotten it yet, and people are really hurting. And I think that's one of the most frustrating things about this right now is that even though we passed a law that would get some money into people's hands and some support, the ability to actually deliver on it is not in place. And people are still struggling because of that. While the money that we sent to the Fed to give to corporations went through without any failure because that's a structure that's already in place. I think that's an indication that the infrastructure needs to be built to actually be able to make these payments to people directly so that we can do this more effectively and that we can pave the way for future things like, for example, a UBI without it having to be this means-tested, difficult process that takes months to be able to get a single check that is not going to be enough to sustain you through this period. Let me scan. All right, looks like Dennis Williams asked about the next stimulus bill and what we should put in the next stimulus bill. I've been using the term that a lot of people are using, a people's bailout. That's what we should have done the first time around. That's what we absolutely need to do now. Some of the ways that we can ensure that we are actually addressing the issues that people are facing is sustaining their income. So unfortunately, because we didn't do that from the start, a lot of people have basically been separated for their jobs. They've lost their jobs. The number was, what was it, 16, almost 17 million people. What we need to do is replace their income. And it can't just be a one-time check. It can't just be a hard-to-get unemployment insurance check. It needs to be like what we've seen in other countries where the government has stepped in to actually make sure that people are able to maintain a standard of living and receive their wages. We should also include a cancellation of rent and mortgage payments. Like right now, that's something I'm still really concerned about in the state of Delaware. We know tons of people missed their rent payments and their mortgage payments on April 1st. I think the number nationally was 30% of people didn't pay rent because they simply couldn't. And with the situation we have in our state right now, what's going to happen is that once the state of emergency is lifted, landlords have 30 days that they can before they can bring eviction proceedings against someone. And same thing for foreclosure or sheriff sale. So what will potentially happen is that people get 3, 4, whatever it is, months behind on their rent. And then 30 days after the state of emergency is done, they're supposed to catch back up. Not going to be possible for the vast majority of people. So what we should actually be doing is fighting to say rent is zero through this period. Another great way to actually keep money in people's pockets would be to cancel their student loan debt. We have been talking about this. It is a economic hardship on particularly my generation, but it really extends beyond that as well. There's people who receive Social Security checks that are garnished for student loan payments. Removing student loan debt would alleviate a really large burden on people. And again, just as a driving force, be focused on people and their needs and not the needs of corporations. Corporations have the structure in place to handle these things. They have the tools at their disposal. But what we've done is we've created a fund for them to get incredibly low interest rate loans that they can just take billions of dollars, leverage that into potentially more billions and trillions of dollars, and essentially pay zero interest on it. Whereas the same is not being offered to individuals. No one is coming to individuals and saying, here's a zero interest loan so that you can cover your rent and we'll get payment terms in place for you. So corporations have already been handed a method for weathering the storm, and we have not done that for people yet. So that's absolutely something we need to do. Just scrolling here really quickly. Okay, so there's a question from John about what should Delaware do to protect borrowers from high interest legal loans during the pandemic. That kind of flows from what I was just talking about. We've got corporations that are able to take on debt with extremely low interest rates, but the same is not offered to individual people. Those loans are already predatory and shouldn't exist. When we have loans that people could be paying 1,000% interest on, that is completely inappropriate and needs to be regulated away to actually enforce consumer protections. It's frustrating because it's one of those things where you're like, this shouldn't exist. So I think getting stronger consumer protections in place is step one. I think that those loans could also potentially be rolled into some of the rules that are in place in the state of emergency. The state of emergency that Governor Carney declared makes it illegal to price gouge. So if you were to walk into your grocery store and, a gallon of milk used to be $5, $6, and now it's $20, that's actually illegal. And you can't be price gouged during this time. I think we could enact the same sort of thing for the rates on these loans and keep them within reasonable interest rates. Or frankly, let's extend the same interest rates that corporations are getting to people. Colin asked a question about Delaware is a solid blue state. How do we push it to the left? One way I like to think about this is less about left and right and more about top and bottom. And I think that conversation is the right conversation to have, because what we're actually talking about is the fact that we have a country that works incredibly well for people who are already powerful and already wealthy, and so many other people are struggling. And frankly, when you start the conversation that way, most people nod their head. because they see that, they live that. Either they live it personally or they see a family member working 2 jobs 7 days a week and still struggling to get by. People, that's their lived experience. And the answer to that are left policies, or policies that center people. And that's how you start to have that conversation a little bit more. And I think people are absolutely open to it. People recognize that things are not the way, this is not how things should be. In the wealthiest country in the world, we should not have people who are struggling to keep a roof over their heads or unable to. We should not have people who need to work 7 days a week just to survive. If you put these things on the ballot, they would likely pass, because people recognize that a for-profit healthcare system is a healthcare system that they can't use. Sure, they have access to the hospital, but what happens afterward? When 3 months later a bill shows up that you weren't expecting, you had no idea what it was going to be, your insurance company in that hospital made a decision on what you owe, and now you owe it. That has happened to the vast majority of people. Most people who get cancer end up losing their entire net worth and their wealth just because they got cancer. So these are experiences that people have. And I think when you speak directly to the lived experiences and point out what causes them, like make it very clear what the problem is, the reason your problem is that you got cancer and now you're bankrupt. The issue is not that you got cancer, it's that we have a system that is based on your ability to pay and the treatment that you get. And that puts a dollar amount on your life. And when you have that conversation, it's much easier to say, and that is why we need to guarantee universal health care that doesn't judge your ability to pay. Same thing goes for education. When, I talk to 20-somethings who either went to college and had to drop out because they couldn't afford their tuition, or didn't go at all in the first place because they didn't think they could afford it and they were afraid or uncomfortable with taking on the debt that would make it necessary, they recognize that the ability to pay was a barrier to them getting an education. And no one thinks that's right. No one thinks that's how it should be. You should not be better able to educate yourself and take advantage of the opportunity that an education gives you simply because your parents were wealthier. So I think when you have that conversation much more about like, what are the problems that we see and what are the solutions that center people and make their lives better, that is how you start to push people towards these policies, and really connecting to them personally, having those one-on-one conversations, listening really clearly to things they say, and finding out, like, is this someone who has a ton of student loan debt? Is this someone who saw their mom go through cancer and come close to bankruptcy? Is this someone who's had to set up a GoFundMe because their parent ended up in the hospital? Like, what is the thing that has happened in their life that you can connect to, and you can share with them a policy that says, you're right, and millions of other people are going through this, and it's completely wrong, and we can solve it in this way. And I think that's how you change the conversation, and you don't just have this left versus right conversation, because these are conversations I've had with Republicans, and they go well, because they recognize that this is not how life should be for the vast majority of people. Emma asked who my team is for baseball. I am sitting in front of all my baseball perspectives books. I grew up a Yankee fan, which people don't like to hear, but I really kind of fell out of love with the Yankees because they didn't invest in a farm system, and they had this way of just buying expensive players, and that wasn't exciting to me. And now I think what happened is, because I played so much fantasy baseball, I got really into like players and not so much teams. But I love going to a Phillies game. I love going to a Blue Rocks game. But as far as favorite MLB team, it was the Astros before they cheated. So now it's like probably the A's, I think, are most exciting. Okay. Sorry, there's a ton of questions, and we only have about 10 minutes left here. Andrew asked a question, what about people without a social security number? Well, I regularly hear they shouldn't be here anyways. I don't think they should have to pay with their lives. Is there a plan for them? Right now, no, there's not a plan for them. They are not getting the stimulus check. And I think that's, I don't know, completely inhumane. People who are in this country deserve the benefits of being in this country. They are contributing. They're tax paying. They should be able to be sustained through this crisis as well. So many. Okay. Mm-mm. Okay, we're definitely getting questions after this. I apologize, but I'm glad there's so many people here who have such awesome questions that feel like I require a really thoughtful answers and response. So let's see here. Nico made a good point. Just want to share with everybody the ACLU of Delaware. They have the Smart Justice campaign, which is awesome. They are pushing for a bill, SB 39, that calls for ending the suspension of driver's licenses for not paying a fine. And it bans courts from imposing late fees for unpaid fines. That's a really good bill because, like, again, same thing where we were talking about before, like this criminalizing of poverty that we have baked into this system. If you can't pay a fine, because our fines are not a sliding scale, you run a red light and you get $100 ticket. That $100 ticket is very different for someone who works at Walmart than it is for someone who works at Chase, as an example. If you have like a higher paying job, $100 is not the same if you are making minimum wage. So what ends up happening is that person can't pay the fine. So they don't, but they have to keep going to work. And because they didn't pay the fine, their license gets suspended, making it impossible for them to get to work. Thus, they will never be able to pay off the fine. And it's this bind that we put people into. And the question is, what do you expect that person to do? They don't have the money. And the only way they could ever get the money is if you actually let them continue to work. But you are taking away their ability to get to work. So I absolutely think that things like license suspensions should not be happening. I think that fines should be on a sliding scale. I obviously think that people's wages should be higher so that fewer people are living that close to the line where any little thing can completely derail their life. Alicia asked a question about what's your plan for the first 100 days? What's the priority list? And how does that list privileged people of color and lower economic people in Delaware who are the most vulnerable? Which is a really great question. So what I have heard from voters that are things that are most important to them are healthcare, education, the environment, and jobs and wages. And I think when it comes to healthcare, absolutely like fighting for Medicare for all, but doing so not only in the Senate, but with people back on the ground. I've said this a lot, that I think what we have to start to do is get representatives who recognize that you have to have both power in the government and power on the ground. And how do you actually coordinate those things? Because right now they're really disconnected. And I think what should be happening instead is, yes, it's my job to be in Washington and fighting for these things, but how can I use the power that I get from that seat to get people on the ground, people back home, involved and fighting for those ideas as well? So I think that's incredibly important, that I am helping facilitate the conversations that activists are having. I think Medicare for All is incredibly important, particularly for people of color in our state, because, again, it goes back to that. It's not just about getting Medicare. It's about overall investment in our healthcare system. And we know that we have differing outcomes depending on race. in our healthcare system right now. We absolutely need to study that more clearly and understand what is going on and figure out solutions that will fix it. It also is incredibly important because we have decent insurance rates in Delaware. I mean, these numbers go back from before a lot of people lost their jobs, so it might be different now. But our state had about a 7% uninsurance rate. So 7% of Delawareans didn't have insurance. However, that number is disproportionately high for Latinos in our state, and they were experiencing about a 20% uninsurance rate. So when we get something like Medicare for All, that takes that 20% to zero. That makes a huge amount of difference for people who cannot get the healthcare they need right now. When we talk about canceling student loan debt, the group of people who hold the most student loan debt in our country are Black women. So if we cancel student loan debt, we are disproportionately helping Black women who will be relieved of that debt. So those are key things from a policy standpoint. And then climate is the kind of other key one there, and wages. When it comes to climate, we know that environmental racism is the thing that we feel in our state. The cancer rates are higher in Blacker and browner neighborhoods and in poorer neighborhoods. When we actually fix brownfields and pollution in our neighborhoods, we can improve those health outcomes. And we also know that the flooding that we see in our state right now happens disproportionately in lower income neighborhoods. So when we address climate change, we have to make sure that it's through the lens of racial justice and ending environmental racism. And same thing with wages. Again, disproportionately Black and brown people are working in minimum wage jobs. So when we raise wages, we are enacting policy that helps Black and brown people. Outside of policy, I think it's incredibly important to stay connected to Delaware. So that's something else that I think we don't see as much right now. I've talked to so many people who I've either canvassed or phone banked who've said, I have never heard from any of my elected officials. And usually what I say back is like, yeah, that's the problem. So I think it's incredibly important to me to actually continue having people in the field whose job it is to continue reaching out to people and not go dark on them, because I am running a campaign that says we absolutely need to put people over profits. And what that means once I'm elected means we have to continue to hear people and make sure that we are surrounding ourselves with the voice of other people that are our constituents, not just surrounding ourselves with the wealthy corporate donors who have the ear of so many of our representatives right now. So that is really important to me, is establishing a team whose job it will be to continue that what's typically considered constituent services, but I think we would put a more outreach-based spin on it and not wait for problems to be brought to us, but actually try to reach out to people. Yeah, so I think we have time for one more. Okay. Sorry, so many. So we're going to have to absolutely follow up with people. Participating. Okay, so Deirdre asked a question about opioid addiction. So she says, my son was here in Delaware, but sent him back to New York after he was introduced to heroin. Here, Delaware has no drug programs to assist people here. How will you change this? Young people are dying. Yeah, it's one thing that I think we can't forget is that the opioid epidemic is here in our backyard, and it's not some faraway problem. It affects people that we know. And when we, again, extend Medicare for All, that absolutely has to include addiction treatment, because it is incredibly hard to get right now. And what ends up happening is that if people need to be put into rehab facilities, our beds are incredibly limited, so people aren't able to get into them. We also have in some of those facilities, there are rules in place that say if you aren't currently using or currently relapsing, you actually can't get into the center. So if you are feeling like you need help, but you're not currently using a drug, it's really hard to get help. So sustaining sobriety is really difficult for people. And I think we also have to address the core issues of why people end up using drugs. And I won't speak for Deirdre's son because I know there are so many reasons, but if it is a mental health issue and someone is using drugs to try to deal with that mental health issue, that's the issue of, again, the inaccessibility of mental health in our country. For people who have insurance, they still very rarely have mental health coverage. Most of the people I know who get mental health services are paying out of their own pocket for those services. And it's incredibly costly. And as Deirdre mentioned, these are people's lives we're talking about. And people don't have the money to shell out $100 to $200 a session to get the mental health counseling that they need. There are economic reasons why people end up addicted to drugs, where they feel a lack of opportunity or despair that leads to drug use. There are physical pain issues that lead to drug addiction. So there are a lot of issues that lead to this. And I think that, again, when we recognize that every single person in this country deserves the health care they need, and that's not just medical care, that it's mental health and it's dental health and it's eye health, it's the whole person, and we actually invest in that as a public good, I think that's when we will start to chip away at this problem. On the supply side, I think that a lot of the opioid use that has been driven by the pharmaceutical companies who knew that they were putting out a product that was incredibly addictive and masked that and continued trying to put those drugs out into people's hands to make a profit, because they were making really, really hearty profits. Again, putting the dollar and a bottom line over someone's life. And then when people can't get prescriptions or they become too expensive, people were turning to street drugs, which are even more dangerous because you don't necessarily know what you're getting there. So I think that we have to also look at some of the sources here and hold the companies accountable who contributed really greatly to this epidemic. But even overarchingly, I think we have to remind ourselves that, like, someone who is addicted to a substance, like, we should not be judgmental of that person. We should think about, how do we help this person? There's a real stigma that's attached to addiction of any kind, and we have to fight back against that and recognize that, like, if someone is in that place, it's an ask for help, and how do we actually make sure that they have what they need to get that help? So I've gone past 8:30. I'm going to shut it down. I know there's a ton of questions that I didn't get to address, so that's awesome. We'll get back. We'll follow up with anybody who had a question. I don't want to leave anybody hanging. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that you stay healthy. If you want to get involved with this campaign, we absolutely welcome you. The best way to do that is to go to jessfordelaware.com. You can read more about me, more about the platform there, and also sign up to volunteer. If you are able, we always welcome a donation. We are paying that money is going into paying organizers who are finding more volunteers for us, and it's going into paying for all of those phone calls that we make to voters so that they hear our story and we hear theirs. So donations that you can make if you're able right now. I recognize there's quite a few people who are struggling, but if you're able, we always appreciate that. Thank you so much, and I'll be back out here on Monday next week. Maybe I'll change up my location next week. I'll try to find a different room in my house so you're not always looking at the same weird books. But thank you all, and have a safe week.